Mark, come here quickly. Sarah, the excited mother-to-be, called her husband. She wanted him to feel the incredible manifestation of the life growing inside her by placing his hand on her belly. I don't feel anything, Mark said, a hint of disappointment in his voice. Just wait a minute. He's probably hiding. He'll start moving again soon. Sarah and Mark had been married for a year, and the little one who seemed eager to greet his parents that day was already deeply loved. Not long ago, the baby had stopped tormenting Sarah with the symptoms of morning sickness. Finally, she and Mark could enjoy her pregnancy. Mark secretly hoped for a boy. From the moment they met at the cafe where Sarah worked as a waitress, they found they could easily communicate. As they started dating, they learned to navigate difficult situations together. But when it came to choosing a name for their future child, they couldn't come to an agreement. I want our son to have a strong, masculine name, not some trendy nonsense, Mark insisted. Sarah was secretly convinced they would have a girl, but if a boy was born, she didn't want to concede to her husband's choice. She suspected that all his name ideas came from her mother-in-law, especially as the baby's arrival drew closer. The newlyweds had been living separately from Mark's parents, but with the impending arrival of the child, Sarah would have to move into Mark's mother's house, which she found unappealing. Maybe I can handle the baby myself, Sarah pleaded with Mark. You just don't realize how hard it is with newborns yet, Mark told her, recalling what his mother had said. And your parents live far away. Even if your mother decides to drop everything and come to help, I won't be able to manage it alone. You know my personality. But Sarah knew her mother-in-law wasn't exactly thrilled whenever she visited. The thought of living under her roof with a newborn was daunting. Oh, don't make things up, Sarah, Mark reassured her. Mom can be a little difficult, but she's kind at heart. Just a bit grumpy. That's our family trait. Wait until I start acting like that. Sarah laughed in response, always agreeing with her beloved. In her eyes, he was an authority figure, a great guy from a good family who had graduated from a prestigious university in the capital. He had appeared in her life unexpectedly while serving coffee to customers. She caught his brown eyes looking at her and even felt herself blush a little. By evening, Sarah was eagerly waiting for his call. The next weekend, she went on a date with him. 2 months passed, and Mark proposed, leading them to start living together. His mother, Mrs. Lawson, wasn't pleased with the quick turn of events, thinking her son was still too young and that the experienced girl had simply seduced him. But Mark only laughed at his mother's concerns. He was happy with Sarah, and once she got pregnant, he was ready to treat his beloved like a child. Mark had suffered from mumps as a child and feared he wouldn't be able to become a father, as his mother had warned him several times. Yet all his worries proved unnecessary, and the couple eagerly awaited the arrival of their first child. The months leading up to the birth flew by, and soon Mark was holding his son. He named him Ethan, just as he had dreamed. After giving birth, Sarah felt very weak, so she didn't object to the baby's name or the move to Mrs. Lawson's house. However, living there was quite unpleasant for her. Mrs. Lawson seemed perpetually dissatisfied, and the baby didn't evoke the warm and tender feelings one might expect from a grandmother. Instead, she merely tolerated the child. Upon first seeing the newborn, Mrs. Lawson convinced herself that he didn't look like her son. No reassurances that he was simply too young to resemble anyone could sway her belief. "I'm sure he's not your son," she would whisper to Mark. "Look at him. He doesn't look like either of you. He's so fair-skinned, and his eyes are nothing like yours. You were born with eyes as dark as blueberries in a tan, while this baby is so pale." Mark tried to reason with her. "Mom, it's normal for children to resemble their grandparents or even great-grandparents," he explained. "Sarah's cousin is a blonde. She probably dyes her hair." "Don't be ridiculous, Mark," his mother replied. "Ethan is my son, and I love him," he insisted. Time passed, and the young family still lived in Mrs. Lawson's house. Sarah begged Mark to move out and live separately, but he just shrugged it off. He had a new job with a good position that required constant business trips, leaving his wife and son in his mother's care. As he returned home feeling like a stranger, Sarah began to suspect that something was wrong. Mark's mood swings and indifference were often followed by bursts of affection, bouquets of flowers and gifts that no longer brought her joy. Watching all this unfold, Sarah grew anxious that Mark might be cheating on her. One evening, while picking up his shirts from his travel bag, she noticed a trace of lipstick on the collar. It felt like an electric shock to her. Her worst fears were confirmed. With trembling hands, Sarah reached for her husband's phone. Why is it locked? He's never done that before. What is he hiding? She wondered. Sarah wanted to know whether she was becoming paranoid or if her suspicions were valid. Perhaps it was just because she had spent so much time at home with the baby and had gained weight, affecting her confidence. Like many women in her situation, she excused her husband's behavior, searching for the cause within herself. Still, she couldn't rest easy until she confirmed or denied her fears. Mark remained affectionate, but he had become more distant. He hardly left his phone unattended, and whenever a call came in unexpectedly, he would leave the room immediately. Then one day, luck was on Sarah's side. Mark had just finished a phone call when his mother interrupted him, and he left, forgetting his mobile on the nightstand next to the bed. Sarah grabbed it eagerly, as if a starving person had found food. She wanted to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. There was nothing suspicious among the calls, except for the name Andrew, which appeared too often. Sarah decided to take a risk. Sarah pressed the call button, but instead of hearing a male voice, a woman's voice came through. Yes, Mark, you forgot to mention something, darling. Have you changed your mind about coming? Sarah silently reset her phone and carefully placed it back down. It felt as though she had slipped into a stupor. Her life seemed to have shattered into a million tiny fragments. What will happen to us now? She wondered. How could this be happening? What am I supposed to do? Mark didn't notice the shift in his wife's demeanor. He was discussing plans with her, but Sarah couldn't grasp their meaning. She simply couldn't hear anything. Her husband suddenly felt completely foreign to her, and the life they had built together seemed to dissolve like a fleeting dream. I want to visit Laura tomorrow. Ethan and I will stay with her for a couple of days. She misses me, Sarah told Mark. Her sister lived on the other side of the city and had indeed invited her to come over. It was convenient to leave now and avoid looking Mark in the eye, listening to his chatter, or enduring his touch. Sarah needed time to gather her thoughts and decide on her next steps. So, she left. Her sister welcomed her and the baby with open arms. And after hearing Sarah's story, Laura began to convince her that everything in her life was fixable. Sarah simply needed to distract herself and focus on her own needs, not just her family. First, Laura insisted that Sarah needed to be around people again and show everyone that she was still the vibrant woman she used to be. A party at a friend's house seemed like the perfect way for her to make a triumphant return. So after arranging for a nanny to look after 3-year-old Ethan, the two sisters set off to drink champagne and impress the men. At the party, Laura's friend introduced Sarah to his buddy James. He appeared mature and serious, but he also turned out to be an engaging conversationalist. It was a new experience for Sarah. It was vital for her to see if she still attracted men or if something within her had been irreparably damaged. James spent the entire evening charming her, and the combination of her anger at Mark and the abundance of not-so-childish drinks worked wonders. Sarah, feeling quite tipsy, woke up the next morning in the arms of a near stranger. Panic set in as she gathered her belongings, realizing that something even more terrible had occurred in her life than her husband's potential infidelity. James, sensing her distress, offered her coffee. Laura just laughed at her sister's fears. She was pleased that Sarah had found a distraction and had taken a sort of revenge on her husband for his betrayal. Laura even suggested that Sarah and Ethan stay at her place for a while to take a break from her years of feeling trapped. You've suffered enough with this family. It happens to everyone. Just enjoy yourself. It won't hurt if that dog keeps running away, she persuaded Sarah. However, Sarah was resolute. She took Ethan and decided to return home to Mark. When she arrived, she was met by her disgruntled mother-in-law, who immediately began scolding Sarah for her irresponsibility and for missing the pediatrician's appointment. They were preparing to take Ethan to daycare and were gathering the necessary documents. Sarah hoped to find a job and was firmly determined to leave her mother-in-law's house, with or without Mark. "Where have you been? And why are you dragging your child around with you?" Mrs. Lawson reproached her. "I was with Laura. She needed my support," Sarah lied, her cheeks flushing. "And I don't need support here, do I? I can't ask for my son. He's always on the road. You're not much better. You should help me around the house instead of comforting anyone else," her mother-in-law persisted. Sarah didn't argue. She felt ashamed of her mistakes and chose to remain silent, hoping her fleeting affair would stay in the past and eventually stop haunting her conscience with guilt. But things unfolded differently. James obtained Sarah's phone number through Laura, and she didn't quite understand why she agreed to meet him. The new acquaintance was a well-known artist, a creative spirit in life, and Sarah found him incredibly intriguing. However, he had experienced a tragedy. Just before his wedding, he and his bride were in a car accident. She died on the way to the hospital, and the doctors fought for James's life for a long time. He survived and spent months in a hospital bed, during which time he discovered his talent for drawing. Sometimes, life takes unexpected turns that reveal hidden talents within people, often without them even realizing it until they face profound challenges that offer them the chance and time to listen to themselves and nurture those dormant abilities. James had experienced both. Sarah bore a striking resemblance to his deceased bride, Clara, and he felt ashamed for having treated her that way. That night, he unwittingly used Sarah's family troubles and his own drunkenness as a means of escape. It was as if Clara herself had come to comfort him. But as time passed, he found himself thinking more and more about Sarah, not just as a girl who reminded him of Clara. The former pain of loss and guilt felt like a dark storm cloud. But as the rain began to fade beyond the horizon, a sense of lightness and incipient joy began to emerge within him, reflected in his artwork. Occasionally, Sarah would visit her sister at home. Her mother-in-law continued to grumble, and Mark remained just as indifferent, distancing himself from her even more over the year. Eventually, Sarah stopped fearing that her affair would be discovered within the family. Deep down, she even wished for her deception to be exposed, hoping everything would finally come to an end. That's why, when someone, perhaps even Mark's next fling, decided to enlighten Mrs. Lawson about her daughter-in-law's actions, Sarah felt a sense of relief. "Why do you pretend not to know that your son and I have long been strangers, merely living under the same roof?" she shouted at her mother-in-law in response to the insults. "He's no saint, just like me," she added defiantly. "Oh, you promiscuous woman. I suspected from the beginning that your son was also born out of wedlock. You won't get anything from us, neither. You know your blonde-haired brat. Get out of my house. I've wanted to do this for a long time, and I'll gladly take on that challenge. But don't expect Mark to easily give up his son. This is his child, and it can be easily proven. I even insisted on a DNA test. You're completely crazy. Are we really going to waste money on tests? Just get out of our lives and leave my son alone," he snapped. But the test was conducted anyway, because Mark's mother was very reluctant to support someone else's child after their divorce. Recently, she was convinced that the child couldn't possibly be Mark's. Sarah was taken aback when her smug mother-in-law shoved a document in her face, clearly indicating that the biological connection between Ethan and Mark was 0%. "This can't be right. Only Mark could be the father of my son," she cried on the phone while speaking to James. "Then we need to do another test," James suggested. "They won't agree, and we don't need their consent. If you're certain he's the father, there's only one option left. We need to check your biological link with the child." At first, Sarah resisted the idea, but James managed to persuade her, and it turned out to be crucial. The DNA test confirmed that she had no relationship to the baby. How is that possible? Sarah couldn't believe the numbers glaring back at her from the paper. "This is not my baby. Then where is the child I gave birth to?" That became the main question, that James began to tackle right away. They first went to the maternity hospital where Ethan was born and discovered that 3 other mothers had given birth that day. 2 had girls, and only one, like Sarah, had given birth to a boy. That's when they began to search for this woman, putting all their efforts into it. Unfortunately, tracking her down proved to be challenging. The address listed in the documents was no longer her residence, and they had no idea where she had gone. Neighbors informed them that the family was disadvantaged and that no one was looking after the children. "She's a drinker," said a former neighbor, "and her husband was an alcoholic too. They seem to have struggled to get by. The youngest boy is with them, while the older one was taken away by Child Protective Services." The search dragged on for months. James had taken Sarah and Ethan to live with him, convinced they would eventually find answers, even when Sarah was on the brink of despair. They also looked for Ethan's biological father, whose information James was able to obtain from a friend who served with the authorities. Soon they found out that the family had moved in with the husband's sister, where they drank together and frequently got into trouble with the police. The child's mother had recently died, and the father was caught stealing again, leaving Sarah's child essentially an orphan, likely living with his aunt. That thought was horrifying. Sarah didn't want to waste another moment. She feared something terrible could happen to her son at any moment, or he could be taken away by strangers like his older brother. She and James decided to head to the specified address that very day. When they arrived, the door was unlocked. Sarah stepped inside and recoiled, struck by the stench that hit her. The apartment was filled with the odor of unwashed bodies, alcohol, and garbage. Among all this chaos, there was no sign of the child. "Tommy," Sarah called softly. She already knew that her son was named Tom, and she tried to be as gentle as possible, not wanting to scare him. She called him by name for the first time. "Tommy, please respond." Suddenly, a disheveled, drunk woman appeared in the doorway. Her greasy jacket and unkempt hair made it clear she hadn't cared for herself in a long time. "What do you want? Who's Tommy? Did you come for your man? Which one is yours?" She kicked the unconscious man lying on the floor. "This one? Maybe. No, I need a boy named Tommy." "Your nephew," Sarah replied, struggling to stay composed. "This parasite. The little rat probably hid somewhere again. Have you seen the brat?" She kicked the sleeping drunk again. "What do I need him for?" muttered the man, likely still dazed. "I'll teach him a lesson when he gets back, so he knows not to wander off." The man lay back down and snorted. "Go to the train station and find your Tommy," the woman snarled before slamming the door shut. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing and seeing. How could fate take her little baby and throw him into such a hellish situation? But James remained focused. He picked up the completely weakened Sarah, and soon his car was speeding them to the nearest train station. "We need to ask the beggars if Tommy shows up at the station. He must have been here before," James said as he began searching for someone who might know about the boy. Most of the beggars hurried to leave when he started questioning them about the little boy. But an old man agreed to help, saying, "He often hides here when his aunt beats him. We beg together. You won't hurt him, will you? He's a good kid. He just hasn't had much luck in life." The old man led them to where the boy often slept on boxes, eyes barely opening as he rubbed his dirty fists against his face. "Why does this beautiful woman call him Tommy? And why does she insist that she's his mother?" he wondered, bewildered. "My mom died. I only have a dad, but they put him in jail again. I'm hiding from my aunt," the boy replied, clearly scared. "Son, your mother is alive. I am your real mother. They just took you away from me," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the child. The boy stared at Sarah's kind, tear-filled face in disbelief. Deep down, he desperately wanted to believe her words. After all the suffering he had endured, he longed to think that his mother would not run away from him again. He yearned for love and care. Sarah hugged his fragile body and pressed him to herself. Their hearts beat loudly in unison, and they both felt that nothing would separate them now. Sarah took the little boy home, and she and James successfully established their relationship through the courts. Tommy never had to face his angry aunt again. When he met Ethan, Sarah was filled with happiness. Both of her boys, her most beloved and dear little people in the world, quickly became friends. They felt like real brothers. Even though they were born on the same day to different parents, they found true maternal love and care in Sarah. While James was not just her husband, but also the best father to these two boys, who were so precious to his heart.